incident commander?
I don't recall.
What about the declaration of a major incident? Do you remember hearing that?
No.
Okay. Now, you say halfway down page 7, in the second line of the third paragraph on that page, he, that's Andy O'Loughlin, had just instructed station manager Dan Egan to manage the FSGs, and then you say, in the next sentence, my assumption is that due to the scale of the incident, they wanted to make sure that there was sufficient control and command in that risk-critical area. So he asked me to take over from Dan straight away. Now, a number of questions about that.
Yeah.
First of all, to your knowledge at the time, had Station Manager Egan done anything yet regarding FSGs at the moment you were given the task to take over management?
My recollection is that we were both on the unit pretty well at the same time, and that Dan may have got off the unit just before I was instructed, but it was seconds rather than minutes. My strong impression is that we both left the unit together and we both went to CU7 at roughly the same time.
I see. So did you hear or observe DAC O'Loughlin giving Dan Egan the task of managing the FSGs?
I don't recall. Don't think so, but that's not to say it didn't happen. I don't recall it happened. I don't recall how I was aware that Dan was responsible for FSGs.
Right.
I recall that my recollection is that I probably got it from Andy, that he said, I've given it to Dan, but can you go and support him as well because of the scale of the incident?
Okay. And so the time between, is this right, the time between Station Manager Egan leaving CU8 to go and do the job and you being given that task was very short?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know where Station Manager Egan was going?
We were both going, I think it's onto Grenfell Walk, where Command Unit 7 was parked. We both walked around there. I can't remember if Dan came onto the unit with me, but we went on to CU7. A colleague of mine, Dan Kipling, was trying to set up BA main control on that command unit. We effectively took the unit off him, and he went on to run that from the grass mound outside the leisure centre. But we took the unit to start the process of collating all the detail that we had on FSGs. I've read Dan's submissions and his witness testimony to the inquiry.
Dan Egan?
Yes. So I'm aware that there's a slight contradiction between his position and mine, so I'm not 100% sure whether or not he went off and then did stuff away from the unit, which is quite possible, whilst I was getting that unit ready to do the fire survival guidance.
Right. I was going to ask you a little bit about that.
Sure.
But first of all, do you recall walking with Dan Egan from CU8 to CU7?
I have a recollection of following, of the two of us walking together. Right. That's my recollection.
Did Dan Egan give you a handover of the role that he had to you at any point?
Not that I recall.
Right. Just focusing back on your arrival and time at CU8.
Yes.
How long were you on CU8 for?
Minutes. Not long at all.
Not long at all. Did you observe messages being received by anybody on CU8 from control about FSG?
I haven't got a strong personal memory of those messages coming through. I know they were there because one of my earliest decisions was to ask that they stop giving the fire survival guidance messages to Command Unit 8 and give them to Command Unit 7, because it was clear that they were overwhelmed with the volume of information coming in, the amount of detail that they had to process, not just the fire survival guidance but the general incident command.
Do you remember who was sitting at the two radio desks within CU8 when you were on it?
I can't remember that.
Do you remember whether Station Manager Dan Merrick was there?
Watch Manager Dan Merrick was.
Dan Merrick was
I know he was with me on Command Unit 7.
Yes.
Precisely the mechanics of getting from Command Unit 8 to Command Unit 7, I'm guessing that he came across with us when effectively Command Unit 7 was put in charge of the fire survivor guidance calls. So I definitely remember Dan being there, and I definitely remember him effectively being the link with BCC along with Tony Peckham.
Right. What about Watch Manager Tony Peckham?
Tony Peckham, yeah, I remember. I remember his role on CU7 vividly and clearly. That that both him and Dan were tireless. They had a really, really challenging and difficult role.
Again, Dan Merrick.
Dan Merrick and Tony. My understanding was they were. In my statement, I made reference to Dan Merrick, but Tony Peckham was also doing that interface with the Brigade Control Centre, with the control with DAC Adrian and Fenton to get the detail of the fire survivor guidance course.
Okay, we'll come to that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. Before we do, can I just ask you about Station Manager Brett Loft? Do you recall him being present on either CU8 or CU7?
I don't.
Do you know who he is?
Yes.
You do? Were you aware that he had been... or he had assumed responsibility for managing FSG calls prior to you being given that responsibility by DAC O'Loughlin?
No.
That wasn't something you knew?
No.
Right.
I am aware that there were a number of officers throughout the incident ground who had the role of FSG. I've subsequently learned that from reviewing the evidence that's been presented here.
Right.
And I think my role was very much about trying to consolidate that widespread, the fact that there was multiple FSG activity going on. So I saw my role was very much trying to become a focal point and consolidate the different streams, the different areas that had started doing that FSG guidance.
Right. And did DAC O'Loughlin tell you that at any stage that Station Manager Brett Loft had been involved at one stage?
Not that I'm aware.
In at least one of those streams of FSG information?
Not that I'm aware.
Did you speak to Station Manager Loft at any stage during the incident?
I don't recall.
Okay. Do you know whether anybody else who had been or continued to be responsible for FSG handling spoke to Station Manager Loft?
I don't know. I think, again, in my statement, I referenced the structure that we put in place. So I had Dan Egan effectively as a station manager with me on the Command Unit 7, and he was the link to the bridgehead. And my understanding is that role was completed by Pete Wolfenden, who was effectively our link to the bridgehead, to the deployment of crews into the building. So it's possible that Pete just talked to Brett, but I can't give you a definitive answer either way.
Okay. Now, looking at page 7 of your statement, if we can, the third paragraph down, 5 lines down from the beginning of that, you say there were FSG structures in place.
Yes.
But I don't recall ever being given a detailed brief of what they were or how effective they were being. First of all, who told you what those structures were?
I can't honestly say whether I was told. One could extrapolate that fire survivor guidance structures were in place because there was the information being taken from CU8 and it was being passed to the command unit, and the procedure is there, and I would have expected that to be in place. It's difficult for me to say whether when I wrote that in the statement that's a sort of retrospective. I knew that there were structures in existence, but I don't recall anybody ever briefing me about what was in place.
Right. So if nobody briefed you about what was in place, how would you go about doing the task that Andy O'Loughlin had just given you, which was to essentially run the FSG calls from now on?
So within the context of fire service operations, it's not unusual, given the limited information, that initial decisions will be made on across a range of different command functions. It's not unusual to get to a point in an incident where you need somebody to consolidate, where you need somebody to find out what's going on and apply a structure to that. So my role, I saw, was to find out what the structures were, find out how we apply the procedure and the policy as best we could to suit the incident and get the information, the vital information about locations of people transferred from control to the bridgehead to the deployments. I mean, I talk in my statement about the concept of fire survival guidance being relatively straightforward and relatively simple. And I think that the complexity is to take the dynamism of the incident, the dynamism of the event, and the confusion that surrounds it, and to try to simplify that as much as possible.
Now, you say your role was to find out what the structures were and how we apply the procedure and policy as best we could to suit the information. First of all, did you speak to anybody about what the structures were?
I don't recall, but I don't recall having that conversation with anybody, but I know that there were people at the bridgehead. So I had Louise De Silva and Glyn Williams at the bridgehead who were doing fire survival guidance. They were helping coordinate the activity at the bridgehead. I can't remember the precise the mechanisms whereby I found that out, and whether or not what happened was me applying a more systematic structure to it, or whether I built on the existing structures. I'm afraid I can't remember precise detail on that, how that happened.
So can you remember how you went about?
What I recall, so within my statement, my recollection is that I needed to apply a structure to this incident, a process, and I've forgotten the precise order in which it happened. I suspect it happened all at simultaneous activity. In that the first thing to do was to clarify the links between brigade control and the fire ground, which was my command unit 7, and that was the message that was sent about 20-something minutes past 2, saying all the FSG should go to command unit 7.
Did you send that message?
I asked for it to be sent. I have a recollection that I asked for it to be sent. Then it was about confirming that we had a clear link between my command unit and the bridgehead. Now, I believe that was Dan Egan and Pete Wolfenden. And then the final piece of that puzzle was to start to get a handle on the huge volumes of information about where people were, the flats they were involved, the numbers involved.
Now, before you put in place whatever structure it is you did put in place, and we'll look at that, I just want to get a feel for what the structure was before your input. First of all, and maybe you don't know, what was the existing structure on CU8 at the time of your arrival?
I don't know.
When fire survival guidance moved to CU7, what was the structure at that stage, in the initial stages?
I don't recall the specific structure, I'm afraid.
Let me be more specific. Do you remember who was receiving information from control on CU7 at the start?
No.
Do you remember how information...
Sorry, can you ask that question again?
Yes, who on CU7
on
was
CU7,
receiving information from
my
control?
Understanding was that would have been Dan and Tony Peckham, who would have been receiving the information on CU7.
Okay, and what medium of communication were they receiving?
I think it was mobile phones. I think Dan Merrick had a mobile phone glued to his ear for hours and hours. I believe that was the method by which it was coming through.
And Tony Peckham told us he was on the radio all the time.
Yes, that wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, Tony was sat on the command. I'm sure you've seen the pictures, but he was sat in the radio operator's chair.
Now, do you remember whether, first of all, they were recording the information they were getting from control?
I've recently gone through this in my own mind about how we were capturing the detail. I know we had sheets of paper with the existing fire survival guidance information that had been gathered together, and I don't know how that got to you, but I remember Norm Harrison, watch manager Norman Harrison, was collating that detail. I can't remember off the top of my head whether or not Tony was recording that on the fire survival guidance pads or elsewhere, I'm afraid. The only thing I can say is that the units were impounded, so if you've got loads and loads and loads of reams of paper, that would indicate that that's where they were being recorded. I can't remember if they were recorded on that or on message pads or other details. Right.
Just following up on something you just said, you say you remember Norman Harrison, watch manager Harrison, collating the detail.
Yep.
This is on CU7, is it?
Yes.
And just describe that for us. What was he doing?
So I'd asked Norm initially, because when we went to the unit, we went with a load of information. We had a load of sheets of yellow and white paper with the fire survivor guidance information on it. We had scraps of paper that had been given to us by Met Police. We had all sorts. We had people stopping us and telling us about their relatives. And what we initially started to do, and I think there's a photograph of it that I provided in the evidence, is just to list the flats on one of the whiteboards. So we listed all of the flats and the fire survivor guidance calls that were in those flats. It quickly became clear that that wouldn't be a sufficiently systematic approach to trying to identify where people were trapped. And that's when we developed the grid of the flats and the floors, which again I think we've provided as photographic evidence, and that's the thing which has the image which has the different codes on it.
Which we're going to come to. Just on what you just said, I just want to break that up a little bit. First of all, the photograph. Can you please be shown it? I think this is the one, and please confirm it. It's MET 000015930. Mm-hmm. Is that the photograph? Or is that the whiteboard, I should say, you were just describing?
Yes, so that's, I believe, that's the initial attempt to quantify the scale of the fire survivor guidance.
Right, now just tracing this through. First of all, is that whiteboard on CU8 or
CU7?
Is it a whiteboard, or is it actually just
it looks like a laminated sheet of paper.
Right.
Laminated sheet.
So that was done on CU7. Whose handwriting is that?
I can't definitively say, but my recollection is that was being done by Norm
Harrison.
Yes.
Right. And do you know whether that information had been transported from CU8 to CU7 and had been transcribed onto the white laminated board by him, or did he write this down as it came in?
So my recollection is that started on CU7. So we started doing that on CU7. Right. It's possible that came across from CU8, but my recollection is that we started doing that on CU7, and that was with all of the data and all the information that had been given to us in order to start the fire survivor guidance, to start the fire survivor guidance on Command Unit 7.
Right. Now, what had that information been collated from? Do you remember?
The sheets of the fire survival guidance pad. So the FSG pad with the four sheets. So we had a pile of those. We've also had scraps of paper. It was the various information streams that were coming in to us. So specifically the pad of information, the scraps of paper, and then the stuff that we picked up from relatives and from the Met Police.
Right. First of all, pads. That's the quadruplicate coloured fire survival guidance information forms that form Appendix 1 to Policy 790, I think.
Yes.
Right. And so far as scraps of paper are concerned, what are those scraps of paper?
So we had bits of paper that I think that I can't exactly remember where they come from, but scraps of paper saying that they could well have come from the police, right, saying there's somebody trapped in so-and-so flat, and because they were handling a number of calls on our behalf, and we were getting stuff from police officers outside our command unit.
Okay, I want to try and put an example, if I can, of a scrap of paper, which I'd like you just to confirm whether it's the kind of thing you're referring to, which would have gone to make up the initial board. Could you please be shown LFB 1968? And go to page 18. Is that the kind of scrap of paper that you were referring to? Just
I don't recall specifically seeing that scrap or scraps that looked identical to that, but I had a sense that there were this information was coming to us from a range of sources.
Right.
So that's entirely consistent with my memory.
Okay. And what about, just to ask you while we're on it, what about page 28 of the same exhibit?
Again,
28, Mr. Documents Director. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, again, consistent with my memory. I don't recall that specific piece of paper, but consistent with the sort of stuff we were getting, yes.
You were getting... And I mean, do you recognise that handwriting?
No.
No. Were the scraps of paper coming into CU7 from outside, or were the scraps of paper being produced within CU7 by somebody on it?
They were coming to us from CU7. Sorry, they were coming to us. My recollection is we were getting stuff from a range of different sources, right. As I say, from the fire survivor guidance sheets, from the existing structures that had been put in place, but also from the police and from members of the public.
Right.
There was a flood of information.
Okay. Can I ask you to look at, again while we're on it, page 29. 29, next page of the exhibit. This appears to be a list of flats with some FSG detail
yes.
On it. Do you recall seeing lists like this on CU7?
No, I don't recall specifically seeing lists like that. Again, that lists of that nature would be consistent with the sort of stuff that we were getting in.
Right, okay. Do you remember who compiled or would have compiled a list like this on CU7?
My recollection is that we wouldn't have been compiling the core list, as it were, the central repository for the information we were getting with the whiteboards. We were trying to get stuff onto the whiteboards. So if we'd had a list of this nature, my understanding is that we would have tried to transpose that to the whiteboard rather than create a list. It's possible that Tony or Dan, in receiving the information from control, would have written a handwritten note onto a piece of paper that they would have then transposed onto the whiteboard. But we were trying to have the single repository of the detail, which we could then consistently transfer to the bridgehead for BA crews to be then committed from.
Right. And still on this exhibit, can I ask you to be shown, please, page 13, going back. This is a message which looks like it's going to you.
Yeah.
It says, from East Side Sector 4, Safety Officer WMB Beale, Watch Manager Beale, Manager B. Beale, 84. Resident still in flat on 10th or 11th floor. Hose reel jet strapped to ALP cage has forced external fire away from flat. Resident appears to be in fresh air but needs rescuing internally. Do you remember receiving that message?
No. No. I don't remember personally receiving that message, no.
Okay.
That's not to say that it didn't get to Command Unit 7 and that it wasn't recorded, but I don't recall that reaching me specifically, no.
You don't. And do you recall whether any messages at all were given to you or sent to you, specifically, of that nature?
I'm afraid I can't be specific on that one. Right. I don't know.
Now, do you remember, and again at the early stages on CU7, how information was going from CU7 into the incident ground?
So, as I say, I mentioned before, my recollection is that Dan Egan, Station Manager Dan Egan, and Station Manager Pete Wolfenden established quite a strong communications link that transferred the information that we had on the command unit up to the bridgehead. What's really, really hard for me to say is exactly when that definitive link was put in. It's quite possible, because I don't think Pete was there right from the beginning, from when we set up the command unit. I think he was there quite early, but it's quite possible that Dan was initially talking to the crews inside the building who had been given the job of fire survival guidance, and then it Pete took up the mantle within the bridgehead and within the building. But I do recall at one stage a colleague of mine, Group Manager Matt Cook, who was an operational review team officer at the time, telling me that his role as an operational review team officer is to kind of quality assure what's going on the incident ground. And my recollection, because I didn't have an opportunity to go to the bridgehead and confirm that things the information was passing seamlessly from us to them, but he told me that it was working pretty well. He thought it was working successfully, and that we were getting that information to the bridgehead.
Okay, let's see if we can just break this up a bit. In the initial stages of the operation of CU7 for fire survival guidance,
yes,
when you were there,
yes,
what method was being used to send the information that Tony Peckham and Dan Merrick had recorded into the fire ground?
So it's really difficult to be absolutely specific, because I think there was a number of methods. We were using radio communications with the bridgehead, I believe, by Dan Egan. So Dan was effectively passing the information out from Command Unit 7. Initially, that would have been to the bridgeheads, to the watch managers who were operating at the bridgehead. But subsequently, I believe it was to Pete Wolfenden, who was coordinating the fire survival guidance within the bridgehead and getting the information transferred to him. But
where was
we also used runners. Sorry, we also used runners. Right. So as colleagues, I think I'd talk about a watch manager, Sean Coltrus, and a firefighter, Mandeep Singh, who were running information to both the bridgehead, but I also believe to various parts of the incident ground as well.
Now, do you remember whether Dan Egan left CU7 to go to the tower?
I was aware that Dan's had a fluid role. He was moving around the incident ground, certainly in the early stages, and there were points where he would physically take a message to either the bridgehead or to different parts of the incident ground. I was aware of that, yes.
Right. But I think just coming back to where we were a minute ago, what left CU7 was a combination, is this right?
Yeah. Of
pieces of paper through runners, perhaps Coltrus and
yes.
Mandeep Singh, and radio messages.
Yes.
And
so within the context of what we're trying to achieve, you're trying to achieve a number of a load of different things at once. You're trying to make sure that the information you've got, which is absolutely risk critical to the people in the building, is being transferred out to the bridgehead, which is where that information is most useful, because that's where they will task BA crews to then commit the searches and the rescue operations. But at the same time, you're trying to collate the detail. So there's a kind of a competing demands there of being systematic, orderly, getting a clear structure on it, but at the same time trying not to delay the passage of information from the incident ground. And I confess that the sheer volume of information that we had at the time means it's really quite difficult to remember precisely the details of how that information was transferring from Command Unit 7 to the bridgehead.
Okay. What did you do, if anything, to ensure that the information leaving CU7, both by radio and in paper form, was consistent as well as up to date?
So this was, in my statement, I talk about the use of the whiteboard and the systematic approach to trying to capture the detail that we were receiving. So what we did was we took all of the information that we got, that we were receiving, and we started to collate it onto the whiteboard. It's not accurate. It will never be. It won't be definitive. There was subsequently, I've learned that people were moving around the building. They were moving from flat to flat. This meant that the numbers in the flats were changing. So it would have been nigh on impossible to give to be definitively certain of the information that we'd got. what we're trying to do is to capture as much as possible of that information and move it on successfully to the bridgehead. Now, I didn't do anything specifically, as I mentioned before. I didn't have the capacity or the time to quality assure that process, to make sure that the detail that was travelling from the command unit to the bridgehead was absolutely accurate. But my colleague, Matt Cook, and it was more of his role within that operational review team, was doing that. So he came back to me and said, looks like it's working, we look like the detail that you're capturing on your board matches what's going on at the bridgehead. So in that respect, whilst I didn't do it myself, I had some assurance that the process was working.
In terms of radio contact between Dan Egan while he was on CU7, do you know who he was speaking to?
My recollection is that he was speaking to Pete Wolfenden most of the time.
Most of the time. And was that so from the start of the operation of CU7 or from later on?
It's very difficult to say. It couldn't have been from the start because I don't think Pete was there at the same time as Dan, so it would have been to the bridgehead, to colleagues on the bridgehead. And Dan would have had to find out who he was talking to, so it wouldn't have been immediate. There would have been a process of establishing links for him. But I believe he did that quite early on, and that happened.
Now, did you know that there was a watch manager operating a collating system for FSG on a car bonnet and latterly by dustbins under the covered walkway outside the tower?
No, I didn't.
Dan Egan has said in his statement, and he confirmed it in his evidence when he came to the inquiry in July, he said that he explained to you that you did have a firefighter at the base of the tower on a car bonnet passing information to somebody within the tower. And it was being relayed up to the bridgehead so that the deployments could be made. That's his evidence. Now, do you recall that?
I don't recall that conversation, but again, that wouldn't be necessarily inconsistent with what I understood to be happening, in that Dan had made links with the bridgehead and was transferring that across. So it's quite possible that conversation took place. I don't recall it, I'm afraid.
Did you know at the time that there was a watch manager standing in the lobby of the tower, receiving written FSG call information and writing it up on the wall? Did you know that at the time?
No, I don't recall that at the time. But again, I think within that phase of the incident, that hugely dynamic phase of the incident, that wouldn't be inconsistent in that people know the importance of this information and they are trying as best they can to get it to the place where it needs to be, which is the bridgehead, so that the deployments can be made. It wouldn't be inconsistent to have multiple people doing that and to have had that happen.
In your contemporaneous note, if we can just look at it, and I'm referring to the manuscript version, on page 2, you say that, and it's a third of the way down the page. I'm sorry, it should be the manuscript version, not the typed version, the manuscript version.
Excuse me.
It's 54. It's MET quadruple 5435. That's the documents director. Thank you very much. Just a third of the way down. In fact, it's just above halfway down. It says Watch Manager Paul. It looks like Sandell. Watch Manager De Silva and Watch Manager Glenn were already in situ in the building and were coordinating existing FSG efforts.
Okay.
Now, you've referred to Watch Manager Paul Sandell. Who was that?
I'm afraid I can't recall the specific detail of that, I'm afraid. No, I can't. I couldn't tell you what his role it's not a name that rings a bell, I'm afraid.
How, doing the best you can with your recollection, and I know it's difficult,
Yes.
given the circumstances in which you came to produce this document, but do you know how the name Sandel came to you? Did somebody tell you? Is it something you remember?
I'm sorry, I can't recall. I can't recall how that name came to me, unless, no, I would be speculating about how it had come to me.
Right. And what about Glenn, watch manager Glenn? Same question. Do you remember how you...
So I think that might be Glyn Williams.
Yes.
But again, and I know that Louisa De Silva was working on the fire survival guidance in the building, but again, it's difficult to know exactly where that information came from, because obviously, you know, I've been aware of the evidence that's been given by those two people, so
Well,
it's quite hard to be specific about where I would have heard that from.
right. And when you wrote and were coordinating the existing FSG efforts, what did you remember they were actually doing by way of coordination?
I don't recall the specifics. Other than that, they would have been taking that detail, passing it to the bridgehead and to the officers deploying BA crews.
Okay.
So it would be an expectation rather than a definitive understanding.
Right. In order to put an overall structure on fire survival guidance so that it got from the control room to the bridgehead in a consistent, up-to-date and seamless fashion, was it important to you to understand what the mechanism of communication was between the command unit and the bridgehead, link by link in the chain?
Could you ask the question again?
Yes. Yes, I will. In order to let's break it up.
Yeah.
I think you told us earlier that your task that you were essentially given by DAC O'Loughlin was to put an overall structure on fire survival guidance.
Yes.
That's right, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, in order to do that job, was it important to you to find out for yourself what the mechanism of communication, what the methods of communication were between the command unit, CU7, and the bridgehead?
So it's quite a difficult question to answer, but the obvious answer for me is that I gave that would have been given to Dan Egan in my respect. So I'd asked Dan to make that link. So I can't remember the specifics of the link, but I did ask. But my understanding was that it was happening. So it's very difficult to answer. Did I put it in place? Did I scrutinise the links, or did I have evidence to me suggested that the links were working and therefore didn't need to provide that scrutiny? Does that make sense?
Well, there are two ideas there.
Yeah.
Let's just focus on what I'm after, which is did you find out from any source what the links in the chain of communication were from CU7 to the bridgehead?
Yes, I understood the links between CU7 and the bridgehead, but that evolved.
Right.
So I don't recall specifically finding out the links on arrival. I think I put over my structure over what was there, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I didn't find out the detailed links before I put my structure in place. No.
Right. Now let's turn to your structure in place. What did you put in place when you did carry out the task that DAC O'Loughlin had given you?
So that would have been Dan Egan to Pete Wolford, and that was my perception of the link between my command unit and the bridgehead. So,
right. Could you just break that up for me?
So Dan was
show
effectively.
us each
So
link
Dan, in
the chain.
effect, once the structure had been applied, Dan in effect was the output from the command unit, took the detail that we had from the whiteboards, from the information that was being gathered, and transferred that to the bridgehead. That was then taken by Pete, who then was managing that process on the bridgehead. That was my understanding of what was happening. And that was the process that I believe was corroborated by Matt.
Right. So, just breaking that down, once your structure was in place,
Yes.
and you were happy that it was being run from
Yes.
CU7,
Yes.
how did the information about incoming FSGs leave CU7 and go to the incident ground?
So it was my impression that that was done by Dan. Effectively, Dan Egan, Station Manager Egan, was passing the information from us to the bridgehead.
Now, where was he?
He was on the unit much of the time, but also he physically, I think, went to the bridgehead on a number of occasions.
Right. Now, to your observation, whenever Dan Egan passed a message from CU7 to the incident ground, whether it's the bridgehead or the lobby, we can come to in a moment, how did he do it? Did he pick up an FSG form and recite its contents down the radio, or what did he do?
I don't know. I can't recall in detail how he did that. My recollection was it would have been through a range of different methods.
Right.
So it was either radio or physically going to the lobby or the bridgehead to pass that information.
Right. And when he was not on CU7, but had gone to the lobby to pass on information, how was information then being passed to the incident ground in his absence?
I don't recall. I don't recall whether Norm stepped in or whether we used Sean Coltress or Mandeep, but it's possible that that's where the runners would have been used. But again, it's very difficult to say definitively.
So even after you put your structure in place on CU7, is it still the case that you were using both the radio communication method and the runner method?
Yes.
Right.
Very likely. I can't give you an absolutely definitive answer, but it's very likely, yes.
And did that continue throughout the night until the FSG calls stopped?
Again, it would be a guess, but I can't definitively say whether it did. My perception was that the structure became more stable throughout the night because we had time to then start to think about other elements of the incident, which I referred to in my statement, which was the activity about cross-referencing where the survivors had gone to the rest centres, to the survivor reception centres. But again, it would be really difficult to say. It would be very difficult to be absolutely definitive about it.
And coming back to a question I asked before, after you put your structure in place,
yes,
and you were still having radio and runners with information, were any steps taken by anybody to ensure that the information on a flat-by-flat basis was consistent and up to date?
I think I've mentioned the role of the operational review team officer Matt Cook before. Now I can't be sure that. So it's quite possible that we took the detail from the grid in Command Unit 7, and that was transferred to, I believe there was a grid within the lobby or the bridgehead area. Now, I don't recall putting any definitive efforts in to specifically identify whether that detail was correct because it was quite fluid. We were still getting huge, the volume of calls was still enormous, but we were aware of the need to try and to get more definitive information on those figures, and that's when we put in that's where I put in the watch managers at the two rest centres to try and find out which flats the people that had come out of the building had come from. And again, it's referenced in my statement.
Right. Now, the grid that you refer to, is that something that you use to coordinate and make consistent the messages going out from CU7?
Yes. So that was an attempt to have a single repository for all of the information that we'd had coming in. So we put the grid on one of the whiteboards within the command unit. That was I believe it was 6 or 7 columns and 24 rows of the different where all of the flats were, and the calls that we were receiving specifically from those flats, so that when we passed the information, we weren't working off the long list, which we felt was confusing. We were working from a slightly more systematic grid.
Right. Let's look at that. It's MET 000159224. That's, I think, the grid.
Yes.
That you're talking about. I suggested
Yes.
that to you. But do you remember how long after CU7 started operating that you set that system up?
I can't, I'm afraid. I think that photograph was taken quite late into the incident.
Yes.
No, I can't remember exactly when it went on. But there would have had to been so it would have had to been long enough for us to write it down on the board to the left of that, realise that that wasn't working effectively, and then transfer it across to that more systematic approach.
Right. Now the board to the left of that we also have, and I'll give it to you. It's it's MET 0001596. If we can just perhaps have both up at the same time. Right. Can you just
okay.
Could you just explain to us first of all what is, if you can, the whiteboard on the left of the screen there?
Okay, so I think this is what I'm mistaken here. So when we talked about the laminated sheet,
right,
that was what I thought we were looking at before. So this is what actually this was where we started the process of collating that detail, and quickly realised that that wasn't going to be enough. So we then moved to the grid. So I spoke earlier on today about the activity that Norm had done, which is to record. That's what I think that might be. Right, okay. So that laminated sheet could well actually then have come from somewhere else, and I can't be...
Well, I was going to ask you then, if the laminated sheet is not that, what is the laminated sheet?
It's very possible that was from Command Unit 8, but I don't know for sure.
Right, I see. And who wrote up the information on the whiteboard on the left?
I believe that was Norm Harrison.
That's Norm Harrison. Now, the grid idea, was that your idea?
I think so.
And who designed it and wrote it up on the board?
My recollection that it was Norm was doing the filling in on the board, but it's possible that Dan, because my memory is that Dan was standing, so if we look at that board now, Dan was standing to the right of the board at the back of the command unit, and Norm was standing to the left at the front of the command unit. My recollection was Norm was doing that work, but it's quite possible that Dan would have put some detail on there as well.
Right. And in general terms, once the grid system had started, do you remember what was the source of the information which Norm would use to fill in the grid?
So initially it would have been the paper, the stack of data that we'd received, the information that we'd received on the existing fire survival guidance calls. But then as the incident progressed, we would have had more information from control via Dan and Tony about the detail of those specific flats. So there's a transfer of information from the stack of paperwork to the board on the left, then to the board on the right-hand side.
Right.
That then would have been corroborated by the further information we were receiving from control.
Okay. And so when the grid had to be changed because you had new updated information coming to you from control, how would that new updated information go from the person on the end of the mobile or radio, which was Tony Peckham or Dan Merrick, to the whiteboard grid?
So either Dan or Norm would transfer that information onto the board.
Right.
That's my recollection.
And how would they get that information from Merrick or Peckham? Were they told it already?
So Dan Merrick himself would have been taking the calls himself, so he could have updated that information. We didn't have there wasn't a formal process. It was updated as required.
Right.
Dan or Tony would speak to Norm. Norm would update the boards.
Okay. Now, I'm going to come back to these in due course if I can. Just taking a step back a little bit, because we've gone quite a long way into this material. Going back to DAC O'Loughlin's instructions, he says in his statement, and he is obviously going to come and give evidence to us, that he told you that the key priority was coordinating FSG calls and establishing how many people we had inside the building, and how many of those were talking to control, how many were a priority, he says, and how many we needed to get to quickly.
Sure.
Do you remember, that's what he says in his statement. Do you remember him saying that, or any of that to you?
I don't recall the specifics of that conversation, but that's not to say it didn't happen. Equally, that would be kind of a given for the fire survival guidance calls and the management of those calls, that those would be key priorities.
He also says that he suggested that the priorities would most likely be the people on the upper floors and those in the northeast corner of the building, because the fire was anticipated to go upwards and not to move laterally around the building. That's what he, again, says in his statement. And again, obviously, we'll have to examine that with him. But
sure.
Do you remember being told that?
No.
You don't? Do you remember having any discussion with DAC O'Loughlin about how to prioritise FSG information?
No.
Do you remember having any thoughts of your own about how to go about prioritising FSG information?
This is something that I thought long and hard about. So yes, the prioritisation of fire survival guidance calls, it's really difficult to talk in terms. It seems almost a misnomer to talk about prioritisation. Pretty well from the moment I arrived at the incident, everybody in that building would have been regarded as a priority for rescue. They would have, the circumstances were that everybody needed to be got out as quickly as possible. Within the structure, the prioritisation from control would have been, we would have received information from control saying that people were trapped by either the smoke or the conditions in their flats, and that would have formed part of the priority. And I think in my statement I talk about prioritisation of lines that had gone dead, that we're trying to get to people who we've lost contact with. But likewise, there would have been a range of different competing priorities, flats with children in them, flats with people with wheelchairs in them, throughout the night, where we would have been attempting to prioritise those. But it's such a fine balance between knowing that efforts needed to be made to get everybody out, so everybody in the building was a priority, but at the same time, that detail changed. And given the sheer volume of different calls we were receiving, the specifics of the prioritisation are quite difficult to recall, if I'm honest.
So, correct me if I'm wrong in summarising your evidence inaccurately, but is what you're saying that in fact prioritisation changed dynamically?
Absolutely.
As the incident
Absolutely.
changed?
So control would have received information from the people they were speaking to on the telephone. That would have conditioned the way they prioritised the calls that they gave to us. Likewise, we received information from those people, and that would have coloured how we prioritised it. That information would have then gone to the bridgehead. The bridgehead would have then, they know which floors they've got access to, which floors they can't get access to. That could very well have shifted the priorities for them. So if I told them that there was somebody there was people in the 18th floor that required rescue because the line had gone dead, but they knew they couldn't get BA crews up there, whilst they're obviously a priority, everybody was a priority in that building, they would have then had to make some really, really tough decisions about where they committed crews to. As the crews are committed into the building, they have been given a specific brief to get to the 16th floor, but if they meet somebody on the stairwell who, in their opinion, is in immediate risk of losing their lives, then their priorities need to shift. So it was entirely I think in the initial opening statement that the OFB provided, that dilemma was across the board throughout the incident. There were times when people's individual decision making had to be made against what they faced in front of them.
Were there any fixed priorities? So, for example, come what may, one must prioritise children first, or people with mobility issues first, or elderly?
No, there weren't any definitive fixed priorities. No.
Did the bridgehead know, to the best of your knowledge, that, I think this is what you've said, ultimately they were the ones who had to make the final decision as to whether to prioritise rescue A over rescue B?
I'm not sure I would couch it in quite those terms, but they ultimately had control about where people were deployed to. So I provided as best I could the information on where people were, who they were, and why they were trapped, but they ultimately knew where they could get to and where they couldn't get to. So the ultimate decision about where crews were deployed to did sit with the bridgehead.
Did you ever find out or come to know that prioritisation had been asked for on the basis of smoke density?
No, I don't recall that off the top of my head. I don't recall that being a particular factor. I've talked again at length in my statement about the closure of the feedback of the loop, about the information we were getting back from the bridgehead, and that within fire survivor guidance procedure and policy, we attempt as far as possible to close the loop. So I will get the information, so fire survivor guidance coordinator will get the information from control from the person in the flat. We will pass that to the bridgehead. The bridgehead will then deploy crews to make that rescue. They will then tell us that that rescue has been completed, and then we will feed that back to the brigade control to let them know. I've said in my statement that we never really managed to complete that loop. No. It's my view that we didn't complete that loop just because of the sheer volume of calls that we were receiving, the sheer amount of information that we were receiving, we were processing, and then we were trying to pass on to the bridgehead. It just wasn't realistic for them to be able to give us definitive feedback on what we'd asked for, on where we'd asked folks to be deployed to. Well,
I'll come back to that part of your answer sure. in a moment, or perhaps a little bit later. Can I just go back then a step and ask you some questions about the move from CU8 to CU7? Do you remember why it was decided that CU7 should be the dedicated CU for FSGs when CU8 had already been receiving a number of them and handling them?
I wasn't privy to the specifics of that decision, but what I can tell you is that the volume of information that was passing through CU8 would have meant it would have been unfeasible to manage the detail of the fire survival guidance calls and run the incident, the command and control element of incident from one unit. Right. It would be entirely appropriate to move elements of the command and control process from one command unit to another, and I think there was multiple command units involved on the night of Grenfell, so I can't remember which unit it was, but there was a logistics unit which provided support, provided resources to the incident ground. There was a fire survival guidance unit, and there was a command unit. That would be entirely consistent with fire service operations to move to get to a position where you can manage the sheer volume of information.
Why wasn't CU7, when it arrived, which it did after CU8, why wasn't CU7 designated as the IC unit?
I don't know.
And leave FSG on CU8 where it had started?
I don't know.
Was there a reason for that, do you know?
Not that I'm aware of, I don't know.
In terms of facilities on CU7, did CU7 have a CSS?
Yes.
Do you remember whether it was working?
I don't know whether it was working. I know we didn't use it. We didn't use CSS as far as I'm aware on CU7.
Sorry, you didn't use it. Is there a reason for that?
The systems that we had in place at the time didn't require it. There wasn't. That was my understanding.
That was your understanding. Where did you get that understanding?
Sorry, it's not. We didn't use it because we didn't. It wouldn't have provided assistance to what we were doing.
Would it record FSG information?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Right. How familiar are you with the operation of a CSS?
Not enormously. Not enormously.
Right. Was anybody on CU7 that night who was familiar with the operation of a CSS?
So, Watch Manager Harrison and Tony and Dan Merrick were all CU operators, so they would have been familiar with a CU7, with CSS, sorry. And I think my understanding is that within Tony's evidence, he provides, he speaks about command and support system.
Right. Because it also, you know this, don't you, that I hope that CSS actually records messages sent
Yes.
by Firelink.
Yes.
So would it not have been a useful resource, at least to be able to have in one accessible place the FSG messages that were coming in?
Certainly, possibly, it would have been good to have the Firelink, the Firelink detail from CSS. But I think that the process that we had, the detail that we captured from from Tony and from Dan was effective in terms of getting that on the grid system that we had. But also in terms of the sheer volume of stuff that we had, I'm not sure how effective CSS would have been about cross-referencing that detail.
Why is that?
Because of just the sheer volume and going through pages of messages to track and trace all of that detail could have been quite time-consuming. But again, that's a speculation. I don't know that for definitive.
Do you know whether a positive decision was made on the fireground that night not to use the CSS?
I don't. I didn't make a positive decision not to use CSS. We made positive decisions to put in place the structures that we did. I didn't make a positive decision not to use CSS.
Did you ask yourself or anybody, well, why aren't we using the CSS?
No.
You didn't. Did it come up for discussion at all?
Not that I recall, no.
Okay. Was there a command unit critical phone on the CU?
I believe so, yes.
Was it working, do you think?
I don't know.
Was it used?
I don't know.
You don't know. When you say you don't know, you don't remember?
I don't recall, no.
Okay. And what about the heli-telly?
I don't think we used the heli-telly. We didn't use the heli-telly on CU7, no.
Do you know, again, whether that was the result of a positive decision or not?
I'm not sure it would have provided any value. Effectively, heli-telly would have given us an external view of the incident. It wouldn't. I'm not sure it would have provided any great support in terms of the fire survival guidance calls.
It would have enabled you, wouldn't it, to monitor and provide updates on external fire spread?
Possibly, yes, but I don't think. But in that context, we knew that the building was being engulfed in a fire. In terms of being able to see that and provide further updates, I don't think that would have been the role of the Fire Survival Guidance Coordination Unit. That would have sat better with the Incident Command, if that makes sense. We didn't have the capacity, I don't think, to be able to do that external monitoring as well and provide that feedback.
Did you know that people had been reported, a number of people had been reported on the roof of the building?
We did have information to that effect at one point, yes.
So would it not have been helpful for those in CU7 handling FSG to know whether there were in fact people on the roof?
We had a number I remember quite late on the incident somebody reporting that there was somebody on the roof. It was really difficult for me to know how that information had been acquired, because there was so much smoke, there was so much density of fire. We also had we had reports quite late on that there were people flashing torches from upper floors. We made every effort when that information came in to try and corroborate that, but there were a number of information streams that came into us that in the end proved to be not valid, or we were unable to corroborate what that information was and whether or not they were accurate or not. You can imagine that in the context of the incident, the scale of the incident, there were frequently threads of information, like people on the roof. I mean, there was one point very, very late on in the incident where we had information that was potentially somebody on the roof, which in my whole experience of the fire service, if there had been anybody on the roof, it would have been utterly unsurvivable at that stage in the incident. We still tried our best to corroborate that information, get further detail, but it was quite clear that that was unlikely to be accurate information.
Would it not have been useful to use the heli-telly link on CU7 in order to verify the report of whether there were people on the roof?
My reading of the incident and my perception of the incident is that the volume of smoke and the volume of fire would have made it almost impossible for the heli-telly to see the top of the building, and therefore people stuck on the top of the building.
Now, I'm going to turn to another topic. Mr. Chairman, I'm not keen to take a break. myself now. If we can go on for another 15 minutes.
How are you getting on with this witness?
I think the answer to that will probably lie in my review of my notes, which is not a very helpful answer to your question, I appreciate. Quite well, but I think, and I won't finish by lunchtime.
Right.
Or rather, but I won't finish by lunchtime.
Right, but maybe with the adjournment you will
Yes,
be able to review your notes.
exactly.
Yes. Mr. Goodall, how are you feeling? We would normally break at 1 o'clock for some lunch. That's another quarter of an hour. Do you feel comfortable going on for a quarter of an hour?
Happy to go on for another quarter of an hour, absolutely.
All right. Should we do that then, Mr.
Yes.
Willard?
Can I?
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Can I take you to policy 790? If you could be shown that, please. Which is at tab 5 of our policy bundle. And I know you're familiar with this. And I just want to ask you about paragraphs 7.6 and 7.7. They're on. You can just go to page 4 at the bottom. 7.6. It says, as soon as resources allow, the IC should give priority to appointing a dedicated officer known as an FSG coordinator, minimum role of SM, to collate, record and retain all the information on FSG calls received and the subsequent actions on the incident ground. Now, am I right in thinking that that was you, that DAC
Yes.
O'Loughlin, as the IC, gave you that role? Yes? Right. And then there's something about the briefing, communication lines and limits of authority. Did DAC O'Loughlin give you those communication lines and limits of authority?
I don't recall the specifics of it, but I think I was reasonably clear on my role within that
Did he
FSG
give you?
code. I don't recall.
It says the briefing must explain the communication lines and limits of authority.
I don't recall receiving that briefing. No.
Right. 7.7. One of the first actions of this dedicated officer should be to speak by telephone to a supervisor at control to gather the latest information on the progress of FSG calls. Did you do that?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
Volume of calls. So the sheer volume of the calls that we had, the fact that I had a link net between the Brigade Coordinating Centre and Control via Dan Merrick and via